I'm Kimberly Walker, and I'm 26. 3 hours ago, I stood in my father's funeral and discovered that sometimes the most dangerous people in your life are the ones who call you family. I heard my sister and brother-in-law discussing my murder like they were planning next week's grocery shopping. But let me back up a little, because the devil really is in the details. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like the family scapegoat. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. I never was the golden child in the Walker family. That honor belonged to my older sister, Rebecca, who at 29 had already mastered the art of being everything I apparently wasn't: ambitious, ruthless, and most importantly, married to exactly the right man. See, our family ran Walker Real Estate, a traditional Illinois company that my grandfather started back in the 1960s. Nothing fancy, just honest work helping families find homes. At least that's what it used to be. My father, Robert Walker, ran the company with an iron fist, but he was fair. Everyone knew he made the final decisions, and surprisingly, that kept the peace. Even when my Uncle Tom and my cousins would make their little jokes about me being too sensitive for the business world, Dad's presence kept them from going too far. I spent most of my 20s being pushed into smaller and smaller roles at the company. Meetings happened without me. Important decisions were made, and I'd find out about them in the break room gossip. Rebecca made sure everyone knew I wasn't leadership material. "Kimberly's just not built for this kind of pressure," she'd say with that concerned sister voice that fooled everyone except me. But Rebecca wasn't working alone. Her husband, Mark, had wormed his way into Dad's inner circle over the years. Mark was smart. I'll give him that. He knew exactly how to make himself indispensable. Dad treated him like the son he never had, trusting him with financial decisions and strategic planning. Meanwhile, I got stuck handling client complaints and paperwork. The dynamic worked perfectly for them. Dad respected Mark's business sense, Rebecca maintained her position as the responsible daughter, and I became the family disappointment who couldn't quite measure up. What none of us realized was that Dad's diabetes was getting worse. He'd started having trouble with his vision about 8 months ago. Nothing dramatic at first, just needing stronger reading glasses, squinting at documents, asking people to read things aloud to him. "It's just part of getting older," he'd say whenever anyone expressed concern. Rebecca and Mark were so attentive during this time, always offering to help Dad with paperwork, volunteering to handle the financial reports, making sure he got to his doctor's appointments. I thought they were being loving family members. I was so incredibly naive. The vision problems got progressively worse. Dad started having moments of confusion, forgetting conversations we'd had just hours earlier. Some days he seemed sharp as ever, and other days he'd stare blankly at documents like he couldn't make sense of them. "Maybe we should get you to a specialist," I suggested one afternoon when I found him sitting in his office, holding a contract upside down. "Rebecca already made an appointment," he said. "Mark's taking me next week." Of course they were handling it. They handled everything now. By last month, Dad could barely see well enough to drive. Mark had become his unofficial chauffeur, and Rebecca, his primary assistant for all business matters. They were always together, the three of them, making decisions about the company's future while I watched from the sidelines. I should have realized something was wrong when Dad started signing papers without reading them. The day Dad died, I was at home organizing client files. Because that's what I did. The grunt work everyone else was too important to handle. Rebecca called me at 2:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my computer screen, wondering how my life had become so small. "Kimberly, you need to come to the hospital right now." Her voice was shaking, but there was something strange about it. Something that didn't quite match the urgency of her words. "What happened?" "Dad collapsed at the office. They're working on him, but..." She trailed off into sobs that somehow sounded rehearsed. I drove to the hospital with my heart pounding, running every red light between my apartment and the emergency room. When I got there, Rebecca and Mark were sitting in the waiting area, holding hands and whispering to each other. They looked up when I burst through the doors, and for just a split second, I saw something in their expressions that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't grief. It was something else entirely. "How is he?" I asked, still out of breath from running through the parking lot. "Gone." Mark stood up and put his arm around my shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Kimberly. We lost him about 20 minutes ago." The world tilted sideways. Dad was only 62 years old. Yes, he had diabetes, and yes, his health had been declining, but he'd seemed fine that morning. I'd talked to him around 10 o'clock about a client complaint, and he'd been completely normal. What happened exactly?" Rebecca stood up and hugged me, but her embrace felt mechanical. His blood sugar must have spiked. You know how he was about taking his medication properly. That didn't sound right. Dad was religious about his medication schedule. He had alarms set on his phone, little pill organizers labeled for each day of the week. He took his diabetes more seriously than anyone I knew, but I was too shocked to process the inconsistencies, too devastated to ask the right questions. The next few hours passed in a blur of paperwork and funeral arrangements. Rebecca and Mark handled everything with an efficiency that should have impressed me. Instead, it left me feeling even more lost and useless. "Don't worry about any of the details," Rebecca said as we left the hospital. "Mark and I will take care of everything. You just focus on grieving." Focus on grieving, like it was a task I could check off a list. That night, alone in my apartment, I kept replaying the conversation with Dad from that morning. He'd sounded tired but alert, definitely not like someone whose blood sugar was dangerously out of control. And why hadn't anyone called me when he first collapsed? I was his daughter too. Rebecca said it happened so fast, but there had to have been at least a few minutes between the collapse and the end. I tried calling the doctor who'd been treating Dad's diabetes, but it was after hours. I'd have to wait until morning to ask questions. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's face from our last conversation. Tired, yes, but still him. Still the man who'd built a business from nothing and raised 2 daughters as best he could. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was overthinking everything. Grief makes people suspicious of shadows. Dad had died of complications from diabetes, a disease that kills people every day. There was nothing mysterious about it. Rebecca had already arranged the funeral for Thursday. "Small ceremony," she explained when she called. "Just family and close friends. Dad wouldn't have wanted a big production." She was right about that. Dad had always been quietly modest about everything. What she didn't mention was that she'd also scheduled a meeting with Dad's lawyer for Friday morning. I only found out about that when Mr. Henderson called to confirm my attendance. "Meeting about what?" I asked. "The will reading, of course. Rebecca said you'd be there." Of course, Rebecca had already known about the will reading. Mark probably knew too. Once again, I was the last to know about something important happening in my own family. But I was about to discover that being left out of family planning was the least of my problems. The funeral was on a Thursday morning in early October. St. Matthew's Episcopal Church was Dad's choice. He'd attended services there sporadically for most of his adult life, usually showing up during Easter and Christmas like a lot of people do. I arrived 30 minutes early, partly out of habit and partly because I needed the quiet time to prepare myself emotionally. The church was empty except for the funeral director making final arrangements near the altar. Dad's casket sat closed at the front of the sanctuary, covered with white lilies and a small arrangement of yellow roses. Rebecca had chosen yellow because they were his favorite, though I honestly couldn't remember Dad ever expressing an opinion about flowers one way or another. People started arriving around 10:30. Dad's business associates, neighbors from the old neighborhood, a few distant relatives I hadn't seen since my college graduation. The turnout was respectable, but not overwhelming, exactly what Dad would have wanted. Rebecca and Mark arrived together, both dressed in perfectly appropriate funeral attire. Rebecca wore a black dress I'd never seen before, probably purchased specifically for the occasion, and Mark had on a charcoal gray suit that made him look like he'd stepped out of a business magazine. They sat in the front pew on the right side, and I joined them. For a few minutes, it felt like we were a normal grieving family, united in our loss. The service was simple and dignified. Pastor Williams, who'd known Dad for about 15 years, spoke about his dedication to family and community. A colleague from the Real Estate Association shared a story about Dad helping a young couple find their first home during a difficult financial time. I managed to hold myself together through most of it. Even when they played Amazing Grace, which had been Mom's favorite hymn before she died when I was 16, I kept my composure. But when Pastor Williams invited anyone who wanted to share memories to come forward, I felt my control starting to slip. I should say something. I was his daughter. I had 26 years of memories with this man, yet I couldn't make myself stand up. What would I say? That he'd been distant but kind? That he'd worked too much but always made sure I had what I needed? That he'd been disappointed in me but never cruel about it? Rebecca must have sensed my hesitation because she squeezed my hand. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to." Her consideration should have comforted me. Instead, it made everything worse. I was such a mess that my sister had to give me permission to grieve properly. As the service ended and people started filing out to their cars for the cemetery portion, I felt a wave of dizziness hit me like a freight train. The church suddenly felt stuffy and overcrowded. The scent of lilies, which had been subtle before, now seemed overwhelming. "I need some air," I mumbled to Rebecca. "The bathroom's right down that hallway," she said, pointing toward a side corridor. "Take your time." I stumbled toward the restroom, my vision getting spotty around the edges. This was exactly what I didn't want to happen, falling apart in public, being the daughter who couldn't handle her father's funeral. The ladies' room was mercifully empty. I splashed cold water on my face and gripped the sides of the sink, trying to regain my composure. The dizziness was probably just stress and grief. I hadn't eaten much in the past few days, and I'd been surviving on coffee and anxiety. Just breathe, I told myself. Get through the cemetery, get through the reception, and then you can go home and fall apart in private. But as I was preparing to leave the bathroom, I heard voices in the hallway outside. Rebecca and Mark, talking in hushed but animated tones. Went exactly as planned, Mark was saying. Thank God the autopsy didn't find anything, Rebecca replied. I was worried about the medication switch. My hand froze on the door handle. Medication switch? The dosage was perfect, Mark continued. Not enough to show up in a standard toxicology screen, but more than enough to cause the insulin reaction. I felt my knees go weak. Insulin reaction? Dad took medication to control his blood sugar, but he'd never used insulin. I still can't believe how easy it was. Rebecca's voice carried a note of excitement that made my skin crawl. Dr. Martinez never questioned anything when I said Dad wanted to try insulin therapy. The beauty of it is that everyone will just assume his diabetes finally caught up with him, Mark said. Natural causes. No investigation, no questions. I pressed my back against the bathroom door, afraid I might collapse right there in the hallway. They killed him. My sister and brother-in-law murdered my father. But then Rebecca said something that made my blood turn to ice. Now we just have to deal with Kimberly, and the business is completely ours. Have you ever experienced that moment when everything you thought you knew about your life suddenly shifts? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell me about a time when you discovered someone wasn't who you thought they were. I stood behind that bathroom door listening to my sister plan my murder like it was a weekend trip to the lake. It needs to look natural, Mark was saying. Suicide would be perfect. Everyone knows she's been struggling lately. Struggling? Rebecca laughed softly. She's been a mess for years. Always the emotional one. Always overwhelmed by family business pressure. People will believe it easily. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep my grip on the door handle. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. We just need to wait a few weeks, Mark continued. Let her get deeper into the grieving process. Maybe she starts drinking too much, stops taking care of herself. Then one night, she takes too many sleeping pills. How long do you think? Rebecca asked. A month, maybe 2. Long enough that it doesn't look suspicious, but soon enough that we can get the business transferred before anyone starts asking uncomfortable questions about Dad's final months. I could hear footsteps moving away from my hiding spot. They were heading back toward the main part of the church, probably to play the role of grieving family members for the remainder of Dad's funeral. I waited until I couldn't hear their voices anymore, then slowly opened the bathroom door. The hallway was empty, thank God, because I immediately doubled over and vomited into the nearest trash can. Everything made sense now. Dad's sudden decline, the confusion, the vision problems, they hadn't been symptoms of diabetes at all. Rebecca and Mark had been slowly poisoning him with insulin, creating exactly the kind of medical emergency that would look natural to anyone who wasn't looking for it. And now they were planning to kill me too. I had to get out of there. I had to think. I had to figure out how to stay alive long enough to prove what they'd done. But first, I had to get through the rest of this funeral without falling apart completely. I walked back into the main sanctuary on unsteady legs. The church had mostly emptied out, with just a few people lingering to offer final condolences to the family. Rebecca spotted me immediately. There you are. You look terrible. Are you okay? The concern in her voice sounded so genuine. If I hadn't just heard her planning my murder, I would have been touched by her sisterly worry. I'm feeling a little dizzy, I said, which was true enough. Maybe I should sit out the cemetery portion. Absolutely not. Mark appeared at Rebecca's side. Your father deserves to have both his daughters there when we lay him to rest. The emphasis on both his daughters sent a chill down my spine. He was already thinking of me in the past tense. I don't think I can handle it, I said, letting my voice waver with what I hoped sounded like grief rather than terror. Of course you can, Rebecca said, wrapping her arm around my shoulders. We're family. We do these things together. Family. The word felt like poison in my mouth. Somehow I made it through the cemetery service. I stood between Rebecca and Mark while Pastor Williams said the final prayers, and I even threw a handful of dirt onto the casket when it was my turn. The whole time, I kept thinking about how they'd murdered the man we were burying and were already planning their next kill. The reception was at Rebecca's house, a beautiful colonial in one of the nicer subdivisions that Dad had helped her and Mark purchase 3 years earlier. Another business decision I hadn't been consulted about. I moved through the gathering like a ghost, accepting condolences and picking at the catered sandwiches Rebecca had ordered. Every time someone mentioned how peaceful Dad looked or how sudden his passing had been, I wanted to scream the truth. But who would believe me? I had no proof, just an overheard conversation that could be explained away as grief-induced hallucinations. Rebecca and Mark were pillars of the community. I was the unstable daughter who'd never quite lived up to her potential. Around 4 o'clock, most of the guests had left. I was helping clear plates from the dining room when Rebecca pulled me aside. "Kimberly, I know this has been an incredibly difficult day, but we need to talk about practical matters." "Like what?" "Dad's affairs." "The business." "Your future with the company." I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What about my future?" "Well, with Dad gone, Mark and I will be taking over operations completely. We've been handling most of the day-to-day management anyway, especially these last few months when Dad wasn't himself." "When Dad wasn't himself because you were drugging him?" I thought but didn't say. "I think it might be best for everyone if you took some time away from the office," Rebecca continued. "Process your grief, figure out what you really want to do with your life. Maybe this is an opportunity for you to find something you're more passionate about." She was easing me out of the company, making it sound like she was doing me a favor. "How long are we talking about?" I asked. "Oh, indefinitely," Mark said, appearing with coffee cups that needed washing. "Rebecca and I have discussed this extensively, and we really think Walker Real Estate needs a new direction. More aggressive marketing, expanded digital presence, that kind of thing. It requires a particular skill set. A skill set I apparently didn't possess." "I understand," I said, because what else could I say? Fighting them on this point would only accelerate their timeline for getting rid of me permanently. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this," Rebecca said, hugging me tightly. "I was worried you might make things difficult." If she only knew how difficult things were about to become. I left Rebecca's house around 6 p.m., promising to call her in a few days to discuss transition details. As I drove home, I started formulating a plan. First, I needed to stay alive. That meant acting like the broken, grieving daughter they expected me to be, while secretly gathering evidence of what they'd done. Second, I needed proof. Overheard conversations wouldn't be enough to convince a jury, but they'd given me a roadmap of what to look for. Third, I needed allies. Professional allies who could help me build a case without tipping off Rebecca and Mark. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd decided on my first move. I was going to hire a private investigator. That night, I sat in my living room with a bottle of wine I had no intention of drinking, and a notebook where I wrote down everything I could remember from the conversation I'd overheard. Medication switch. Insulin reaction. Dr. Martinez. Autopsy didn't find anything. Natural causes. The pieces were starting to form a picture, and it was worse than I'd initially thought. They hadn't just killed Dad in a moment of opportunity. This had been a planned, methodical murder carried out over months. I thought back to all those doctor's appointments Mark had driven Dad to, all the times Rebecca had helped him organize his medications. They'd been slowly replacing his actual prescriptions with insulin, creating exactly the kind of medical crisis that would look like natural complications from diabetes. The genius of it was the timing. Dad's vision problems and confusion would have masked any symptoms from the insulin injections until it was too late. And by the time he collapsed at the office, his system was so compromised that emergency treatment wouldn't have been effective, but I still needed proof that would hold up in court. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Not that I technically had a job anymore since Rebecca and Mark were restructuring, and started researching private investigators in the Chicago area. I needed someone with experience in criminal cases, someone who understood medical fraud and family disputes. After spending 3 hours reading online reviews and checking credentials, I found exactly what I was looking for. James Malloy had been a Chicago police detective for 15 years before starting his own investigation firm. His website showed experience with insurance fraud, medical malpractice, and what he delicately termed domestic criminal matters. I called his office at 10 a.m. and explained that I needed to discuss a potential wrongful death case involving family members. His assistant scheduled me for that afternoon. Malloy's office was in a converted warehouse in a gentrifying neighborhood on the south side. Nothing fancy, but clean and professional. The man himself was probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of steady, observant eyes that made me feel like he was cataloging details about me before I even sat down. "Ms. Walker, tell me what brings you here." I'd rehearsed this conversation, but actually saying the words out loud was harder than I'd expected. "I believe my father was murdered by my sister and brother-in-law, and I think they're planning to kill me next." Most people would have reacted with surprise or skepticism. Malloy just picked up a pen and opened a fresh notebook. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" For the next hour, I told him everything. Dad's decline, the strange medical symptoms, the funeral conversation, Rebecca and Mark's sudden urgency to get me out of the business. Malloy listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes but never looking doubtful or dismissive. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You understand that what you overheard, while disturbing, isn't evidence by itself. I know. That's why I need your help. What kind of timeline are we working with? Based on what you heard, how long do you think you have before they escalate things? I'd been thinking about that constantly. They said a month or two, long enough that my death won't look connected to Dad's, but soon enough to get control of the business before anyone starts asking questions. That gives us some time, but not much. Malloy consulted his calendar. I can start immediately, but I'll need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you to do it. Can you handle that? Yes. First thing, you need to act completely normal. Grieving, struggling with work stress, maybe drinking a little too much. Give them exactly the behavior they're expecting to see. That part wouldn't require much acting. Second, I need access to any medical records, financial documents, or business papers related to your father's care over the past year. Can you get those? I thought about it. Some of them, yes. Rebecca and Mark handled most of the business side, but I still have access to Dad's personal files. Good. Also, do you know which doctor's office they mentioned? Dr. Martinez? I can find out. Dad used the same family practice for years, but if they were getting insulin from someone else, that would be a separate appointment. Malloy nodded. We'll need to be very careful about how we approach this. If they realize you're investigating, it could accelerate their timeline significantly. The weight of that settled over me. I was walking a tightrope between gathering evidence and staying alive. How much is this going to cost? I asked, because I needed to know if I could afford to save my own life. My standard rate is $75 an hour plus expenses. Given the urgency and complexity of this case, I estimate we'll need 60-80 hours of work over the next month. $6,000. I had about $8,000 in my checking account and another $4,000 in savings. It would wipe out most of my financial cushion, but it was better than being wiped out permanently. I'll take the case, Malloy said, but I need you to understand something. If we find evidence that your father was murdered, this becomes a criminal matter. We'll have to involve law enforcement, and there's no guarantee how that will play out. I understand. And if we're right about their plans for you, there's going to be a point where we need to get you someplace safe while the investigation concludes. I hadn't thought about that part. Where do you go when your own family is trying to kill you? We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Malloy said, reading my expression. For now, let's focus on gathering evidence. Can you come back tomorrow morning? I want to go over your father's medical history in detail and start mapping out our investigation strategy. As I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since Dad's death, I wasn't completely alone in this, but I also felt the weight of what I was about to undertake. I was going to war with my own family, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Rebecca called that evening to check on me, her voice full of sisterly concern. How are you holding up? She asked. I know yesterday was overwhelming. I'm managing, I said, letting exhaustion color my voice. It still doesn't feel real. That's completely normal. Grief is a process, and everyone moves through it differently. If only she knew how much processing I was actually doing. I was thinking, Rebecca continued, maybe you should take a little vacation. Get away from everything for a while. Mark and I could handle any remaining business details, and you could focus on taking care of yourself. There it was. The gentle push toward isolation, exactly what Malloy had predicted. Maybe, I said. I'm too tired to think about it right now. Of course. Just know that we're here for you, whatever you need. What I need, I thought after hanging up, is for you to confess to murder and save me the trouble of proving it. But I had a feeling this was going to be much more complicated than that. The next morning, I met Malloy at a coffee shop 3 blocks from his office instead of going directly to his building. He'd suggested the change of location as a precaution. Never assume you're not being watched, he'd said. I brought a file folder containing everything I'd been able to gather from Dad's home office. Medical appointment cards, insurance statements, prescription receipts, and business correspondence from the past year. This is perfect, Malloy said, flipping through the papers. Look at this. He pulled out a prescription receipt dated 6 weeks before Dad's death. Instead of Dad's usual family doctor, Dr. Peterson, this one was from Dr. Elena Martinez at Chicago Endocrine Associates. That's the name from the conversation, I said. Right, and look at what was prescribed. I leaned closer to read the receipt. Insulin glargine, 10 ml vial, quantity, 3. Dad never used insulin, I said. His diabetes was controlled with oral medication. According to this, he was prescribed enough insulin to last almost 2 months. For someone who's never used it before and doesn't have proper training on dosage, Malloy's voice trailed off. They could have easily given him too much, or given it to him without his knowledge. Insulin is clear and can be injected into food or drinks in small amounts over time. I felt sick thinking about it. All those family dinners at Rebecca's house. All the times Mark had brought Dad coffee at the office. They'd been slowly poisoning him, and everyone had attributed his declining health to the progression of his diabetes. "We need to talk to Dr. Martinez," I said. "We will, but carefully. If she was complicit in this, approaching her directly could warn Rebecca and Mark that someone's investigating." Malloy pulled out his phone and made a note. "I have a contact at Chicago PD who owes me a favor. He might be able to run an informal check on Dr. Martinez's practice, see if there have been any complaints or unusual prescribing patterns. What do I do in the meantime?" "Keep playing your role. Grieving daughter, struggling with the loss, maybe having some trouble functioning, but I also need you to do something that's going to be difficult." I waited. "I need you to get closer to Rebecca and Mark. Spend time with them. Let them think you're becoming more dependent on their support. People make mistakes when they feel safe, and right now they think they've gotten away with murder." The thought of spending time with Dad's killers made my stomach turn, but I understood the logic. "They mentioned something about transferring business assets," I said. "Maybe I should ask Rebecca about that. Act like I'm worried about my financial future." "That's perfect. Show them you're vulnerable and concerned about money. It'll reinforce their belief that you're not a threat." We spent another hour going through Dad's papers, building a timeline of his medical appointments and prescription changes. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. A gradual introduction of insulin therapy that coincided perfectly with his cognitive decline and vision problems. "Here's what's going to happen next," Malloy said as we prepared to leave. "I'm going to start background checks on Rebecca and Mark, look into their financial situation, and see if there were any pressures that might have motivated this. I'm also going to have a colleague approach Dr. Martinez's office as a potential patient, see what we can learn about how she operates." "How long will that take? A few days? Maybe a week?" "While I'm doing that, you need to document everything Rebecca and Mark say to you. Get a small digital recorder if you can, but be very careful about when and how you use it." After leaving the coffee shop, I drove to Dad's house to continue searching through his personal papers. Rebecca had given me a key and told me to take whatever I wanted for sentimental reasons, which was both generous and convenient for my investigation. Dad's home office was exactly as he'd left it, neat, organized, and filled with the careful documentation of a man who'd built his business through attention to detail. But as I went through his files, I found something that made my blood run cold. In a folder marked Medical 2023, there was a note in Dad's handwriting dated 3 months before his death. "Feeling confused after lunch meetings with R&M. Can't seem to focus on paperwork afterward. Need to ask Dr. Peterson about adjusting medication. They'd been drugging him for months, probably putting insulin in his coffee or lunch during their business meetings. Dad had noticed something was wrong but had attributed it to his existing medical condition." I found 2 more similar notes, documenting episodes of confusion and disorientation that coincided with times I knew he'd been alone with Rebecca and Mark. This was evidence, real evidence that could support our theory. I was photographing the notes with my phone when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see Rebecca's silver BMW parked behind my car. Panic shot through me. I wasn't supposed to be here today, and I definitely wasn't supposed to be going through medical files. I quickly put everything back where I'd found it and grabbed a photo of Dad and me from his desk, something that would look like normal sentimental behavior. Rebecca came through the front door just as I was emerging from the office. "Kimberly, I didn't expect to see you here today. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to come get a few things," I said, holding up the photo. "I hope that's okay." "Of course it's okay. This is hard for all of us." She looked around the house with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Have you taken anything else?" "Just this. Everything else feels too..." I let my voice break a little. "It's too hard right now." Rebecca's expression softened. "I understand. Actually, I'm glad you're here. Mark and I have been talking, and we want to help you get through this difficult time." "Here it comes," I thought. "We know Dad's death has left you in a precarious position financially," she continued. "No job, no immediate prospects. We'd like to offer you something." I waited. "A settlement. Not from the will. That won't be read until next week, but from the business accounts. Enough to get you back on your feet, maybe help you start fresh somewhere new. Somewhere new. Away from Illinois, away from anyone who might notice if something happened to me." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. $200,000. Cash. You could take some time, travel, figure out what you really want to do with your life. $200,000 was more money than I'd ever had at one time. It was also nowhere near what my share of Dad's business should be worth. They were buying me out cheap and sending me away where they could arrange for my accident more easily. That's very generous," I said. "Can I think about it?" "Of course. But we'd need an answer soon. The business transition needs to happen quickly, and having this settled would make everything easier." As I drove home, I realized that Rebecca and Mark were moving faster than Malloy had predicted. The offer of money was just the first step in getting me out of town and into a position where they could finish what they'd started. I had maybe 2 weeks to prove they'd murdered Dad before they murdered me, too. The clock was ticking, and I was running out of time to stay alive. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew someone was lying to you but had to pretend to believe them? Share your experience in the comments below, and let me know what you think Kimberly should do next. 2 days after Rebecca's generous offer to buy my silence, Malloy called with news that made my hands shake. "Dr. Martinez is dead," he said without preamble. "Car accident yesterday evening. Ran off the road on her way home from the office." My coffee mug hit the kitchen counter harder than I intended. That's not a coincidence. No, it's not. My contact at Chicago PD said the scene looked staged. Fresh brake marks that don't match the story, and her car went through a guardrail that should have stopped the vehicle. Rebecca and Mark were cleaning up loose ends. Dr. Martinez must have known too much about the insulin prescriptions, and now she was permanently silenced. "This changes everything," I said. "They're not waiting anymore. Which means neither can we. I need you to meet me tonight, but not at my office. There's a diner called Murphy's on Route 34, about 20 minutes south of your apartment. Can you be there at 8? I could, but first I had something else to do, something dangerous but necessary. At 6 o'clock, I called Rebecca and asked if I could come over to discuss her offer. She sounded pleased, probably thinking I was ready to take the money and disappear. Their house was a testament to success. Marble countertops, hardwood floors, and furniture that cost more than I made in 6 months. Mark answered the door wearing khakis and a polo shirt, the picture of suburban prosperity. "Kimberly, come in. Rebecca's just finishing up dinner." The domestic scene felt surreal. Here they were, playing house after committing murder and planning another one. "I've been thinking about your offer," I said as we settled in the living room. "It's very generous." "We want what's best for you," Rebecca said, emerging from the kitchen with 3 glasses of wine. "After everything you've been through." I accepted the wine but didn't drink it. Who knows what they might have added. "I do have some questions about Dad's business interests," I continued. "I want to make sure I understand what I'm signing away." Mark leaned forward. "What kind of questions?" "Well, there were some medical expenses in the final months that seemed unusual. Dr. Martinez's office, some prescriptions that weren't covered by insurance." I watched their faces carefully. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Mark's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dad's health was complicated toward the end," Rebecca said smoothly. "We wanted to make sure he had the best possible care." "Of course. I just wondered why he needed insulin when Dr. Peterson had always managed his diabetes with oral medication." The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds too long. "Sometimes treatment protocols change," Mark said finally. Dr. Peterson referred him to a specialist for a second opinion. That was interesting. They were sticking to a story about legitimate medical care, which meant they'd thought through their cover story carefully. "I'm sure you're right," I said, letting relief color my voice. I was worried there might be something I didn't understand about his condition. Rebecca relaxed visibly. "You don't need to worry about any of that. Mark and I handled all the medical details so you could focus on supporting Dad emotionally." "You both were so good to him," I said, and meant it in the worst possible way. We spent another 20 minutes discussing the financial settlement. They wanted me to sign papers transferring my interest in the business in exchange for $50,000 and a promise to relocate to another state within 6 months. "Why the relocation requirement?" I asked. "It might be easier for you to start fresh somewhere new," Mark explained. "Illinois has too many memories. Too many potential witnesses," he meant. I told them I needed a few more days to consider everything, and Rebecca walked me to the door with sisterly concern. "I know this is overwhelming," she said, hugging me, "but trust us. We have your best interests at heart." If only she knew how clearly I could see what their interests actually were. Murphy's Diner was exactly the kind of place Malloy would choose for a clandestine meeting. Dimly lit, mostly empty, and staffed by servers who minded their own business. I found him in a back booth, nursing coffee and looking like he hadn't slept much. "Dr. Martinez's death confirmed what we suspected," he said as I sat down. "This is moving faster than we anticipated." "They want me to sign papers," I said. "Settlement agreement, relocation requirement, the works." "Don't sign anything. Not yet." He pulled a manila envelope from beside him. "I've got something that changes everything." Inside the envelope were photocopies of medical records, insurance claims, and what looked like bank statements. "How did you get these?" "Dr. Martinez's office manager. Turns out she'd been keeping duplicates of questionable prescriptions because something felt wrong about the whole situation." I scanned the documents. Dr. Martinez had prescribed insulin for my father, based on a referral that didn't exist, and medical records that had been falsified. "Look at this." Malloy pointed to a bank statement. 3 payments of $5,000 to Dr. Martinez's personal account, all from an LLC registered to Mark Thompson. Mark had been paying the doctor to prescribe medication that would kill my father. "This is enough for criminal charges," I said. "It's enough to start an investigation, but we still need to keep you alive long enough for the legal system to work. What do you think will happen next?" Drop your predictions in the comments below and let me know if you've ever had to choose between confronting family or protecting yourself. The next morning brought news that made my blood run cold. Rebecca called at 7 a.m., her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine panic. "Kimberly, something terrible has happened. Someone broke into Dad's house last night." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What do you mean, broke into the house?" "The police called me an hour ago. Neighbors heard breaking glass around midnight. When the officers got there, Dad's office had been ransacked. Papers everywhere, file cabinets emptied." My heart pounded. Had they found Dad's notes about feeling confused after meetings? The medical files I'd photographed? "Did they take anything valuable?" I asked. "That's the strange part. The TV was still there. Mom's jewelry box was untouched. Whoever did this was only interested in papers and documents." Rebecca was fishing, trying to figure out if I knew anything about what the burglars might have been looking for. "Maybe someone thought Dad kept cash in the office," I suggested. "Maybe. But Kimberly, I'm worried this might be connected to business competitors or disgruntled clients. Maybe it's not safe for you to be involved with the company right now." There it was, the gentle push toward accepting their settlement and disappearing. "You think someone would target me? I don't want to find out. Mark and I think you should seriously consider our offer. Get out of Illinois. Start fresh somewhere safe." After hanging up, I called Malloy immediately. When I explained about the break-in, he was quiet for a long moment. "They're looking for evidence," he said finally. "Something spooked them, and now they're trying to clean up anything that might connect them to your father's death." "Does this mean they know I'm investigating?" "Not necessarily. It could just be general paranoia. But we need to assume the worst and act accordingly." "What do you mean?" "I mean you can't go home tonight. Or any night for the foreseeable future." The reality hit me like a freight train. I was homeless now, a refugee from my own family. Malloy arranged for me to stay in an extended stay hotel under an assumed name, Sarah Mitchell, according to the fake ID he provided. Apparently, private investigators had more resources than I'd realized. "How long will I have to live like this?" I asked as we sat in the hotel's lobby that evening. "Until we have enough evidence to arrest Rebecca and Mark? Or until we can get you into witness protection?" Witness protection? The phrase sounded like something from a crime show, not my actual life. "If this goes to trial, you'll be the state's primary witness. Your testimony about the conversation you overheard, combined with the medical evidence and financial records, should be enough to convict them." "Should be?" "There are no guarantees, Kimberly, but we're building a solid case." That night, alone in a sterile hotel room, I realized how completely my life had been turned upside down. A week ago, I'd been a struggling real estate agent with a complicated family. Now I was hiding from my sister and brother-in-law while investigators built a murder case. The next day, Malloy called with an update that made everything more urgent. "The Chicago PD is officially opening an investigation into Dr. Martinez's death. They found evidence that her brake lines had been cut. So it was definitely murder." Definitely, which means Rebecca and Mark are getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, but they also become more dangerous. What kind of mistakes? I'm hoping they'll try to contact Dr. Martinez's office manager, the woman who gave us the documents. If they do, we'll have them on attempted witness intimidation. And if they don't make mistakes? Malloy was quiet for a moment. Then we'll have to force their hand. I didn't like the sound of that, but I was running out of options. The hotel was safe but temporary, and I couldn't hide forever. That afternoon, Rebecca called again. This time her tone was different. Less concerned sister, more business negotiator. "Kimberly, we need to finalize this settlement agreement. Mark's lawyer has prepared all the paperwork. I told you I needed more time to think about it. Well, time's up. There are some business obligations that require immediate attention, and we can't move forward while your ownership stake is unresolved." The pressure was increasing. Whatever timeline they'd originally planned was being accelerated. What if I don't want to sell my share of the business? The silence on the other end of the line lasted just long enough to be threatening. "That would be unfortunate," Rebecca said finally. "Dad built this company for the family, and family members who can't contribute should step aside gracefully. And if I don't step aside gracefully, then we'll have to explore other options. Other options, like the kind of car accident that had killed Dr. Martinez." "I need one more week," I said. "You have 3 days, Kimberly. After that, we'll have to make some difficult decisions about the future of this family. After she hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time. 3 days. In 72 hours, Rebecca and Mark would stop pretending to care about my well-being and start actively trying to kill me. I called Malloy and told him about the deadline. 3 days, he said. That's not much time. Is it enough? It's going to have to be. Tomorrow morning, we're going to set a trap for your loving family. Are you ready to find out just how far they're willing to go? I thought about my father, slowly poisoned by the people he trusted most. I thought about Dr. Martinez, murdered to cover up their crime. I thought about the choice between risking everything to seek justice or spending the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. I'm ready, I said. It was time to stop running and start fighting back. Malloy's trap was elegant in its simplicity. I would call Rebecca and tell her I'd found something in Dad's papers that proved she and Mark had been stealing from the business. I'd claim to have documents that could send them to prison for embezzlement. But embezzlement isn't what they're guilty of, I said as we prepared for the call. No, but they don't know what you actually found. They'll assume you discovered financial irregularities and missed the medical evidence. People tend to confess to lesser crimes to avoid greater ones. The plan was to arrange a meeting where I'd supposedly hand over the documents in exchange for a larger settlement. Malloy would be recording everything from a surveillance van, and Chicago PD would be standing by. What if they just try to kill me during the meeting? They won't. Too public, too risky. They'll want to see what evidence you have first, then they'll try to eliminate both you and the documents afterward. I made the call from Malloy's office, my hands shaking as I dialed Rebecca's number. I found something in Dad's files, I said without preamble when she answered. What kind of something? Bank statements, canceled checks, some very interesting financial records. It looks like someone's been siphoning money from the business for months. I could hear Rebecca breathing on the other end of the line. Kimberly, what exactly are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. $50,000 in unauthorized withdrawals, all signed by either you or Mark. You don't understand what you're looking at. Those transactions were legitimate business expenses. Really? Because the memo lines say things like personal vehicle payment and home renovation costs. Another long pause. When Rebecca spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Where are you? We need to discuss this face to face. I don't think so. I think I need to take these documents to a lawyer. Wait. Don't do anything hasty. If there are financial irregularities, we can resolve this within the family. How? Meet with us. Tonight. Bring whatever you found and we'll explain everything. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. I looked at Malloy, who nodded. Where? I asked. The office. 7 o'clock. Just the three of us. No lawyers. No drama. Fine. But Rebecca, if this isn't what it looks like, you better have a very good explanation. We will. And Kimberly, don't mention this to anyone else until after we talk. Please. After I hung up, Malloy checked his recording equipment one more time. Beautiful work. You sounded genuinely angry and confused. I am genuinely angry, just not about embezzlement. That evening, I drove to Walker Real Estate feeling like I was heading to my own execution. The office building looked different in the fading light. Less like the family business where I'd grown up and more like the site of an impending confrontation. Malloy's van was parked across the street, disguised as a heating repair service. I wore a tiny microphone taped under my shirt and carried a briefcase full of fake financial documents that Malloy had prepared. Rebecca and Mark were waiting in the conference room. Rebecca looked nervous, but Mark seemed oddly calm for someone about to be accused of embezzlement. When he spoke, his voice had that cold edge I'd noticed more often lately. Even Rebecca seemed to tense when he used that tone. Show us what you found, he said without bothering with pleasantries. I opened the briefcase and spread the fake documents across the conference table. Bank statements with highlighted entries, canceled checks, financial summaries that painted a picture of systematic theft. Mark studied the papers for about 30 seconds before he started laughing. This is what has you so upset? He said. Financial records from a business you don't even understand? I understand theft when I see it. You understand nothing, Rebecca snapped, her mask finally slipping. You never understood this business, never understood what it takes to run a real company. I understand $50,000 in unauthorized withdrawals. Mark leaned back in his chair, still smiling. Kimberly, those weren't unauthorized. Your father approved every single transaction. Dad never would have approved personal expenses being paid from business accounts. Your father approved a lot of things in his final months, Rebecca said. His judgment wasn't exactly reliable. There it was, an admission that they'd been taking advantage of Dad's compromised mental state. His judgment was fine, I said. Was it? Mark pulled out his phone and showed me a series of text messages. These are from your father, authorizing various expenditures. All time-stamped, all legitimate. I looked at the messages. They were from Dad's phone number, but something about the language seemed wrong. Dad never texted like this, I said. He always called for business matters. People change their habits, Rebecca said, especially when they're not thinking clearly. You mean when they're being drugged? The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Rebecca's face went white, and Mark's smile disappeared entirely. What did you just say? Mark's voice was deadly quiet. I said you were drugging him with insulin, slowly poisoning him over months until his system finally couldn't take it anymore. Rebecca stood up so quickly her chair fell backward. You're insane. You're having some kind of breakdown. Dr. Martinez prescribed insulin for a man who didn't need it, based on falsified medical records. 3 payments of $5,000 each from your personal account, Mark. Mark's face had gone completely expressionless. When he spoke, his voice was different, colder than I'd ever heard it. You don't know what you're talking about. I know you killed my father. And I know you're planning to kill me, too. That's when Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. The conference room went dead silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mark held the gun casually, like it was a normal business accessory. Well, he said, this is unfortunate. Rebecca stared at her husband in shock. Mark, what are you doing? Cleaning up your mess, he replied without taking his eyes off me. Your sister knows too much. You brought a gun to our family business? I've been carrying it for weeks ever since Dr. Martinez started asking too many questions. Mark's voice was matter of fact, like he was discussing the weather. Insurance policy. I kept my hands visible and tried to stay calm. Malloy was listening to everything, but the police couldn't storm in without putting me in more danger. Rebecca, I said carefully, you need to think about what's happening here. Shut up, Mark snapped. Rebecca, go lock the front door and turn off the lights. Make it look like we're closed. Mark, we can't. We can't shoot my sister. We can and we will unless you have a better idea for dealing with this situation. Rebecca looked back and forth between us, and I could see her calculating. She'd committed murder once already. What was one more? There has to be another way, she said finally. Like what? She knows about the insulin. She knows about Dr. Martinez. And apparently she's been investigating us long enough to find financial records. Mark gestured with the gun. How exactly do you propose we handle this? I needed to keep them talking until backup arrived. Rebecca, he's going to kill both of us, you know that, right? Don't be ridiculous. Think about it. I'm a liability because I know what you did, but you're a liability too because you helped him do it. Mark's jaw tightened. Rebecca, ignore her. She's trying to manipulate you. Am I? Rebecca, what happens after he shoots me? You think he's going to trust you to keep this secret forever? You think he's not going to worry about you having guilt attacks or confessing to save your own soul? Rebecca, for God's sake, go lock that door. But Rebecca was staring at her husband with growing understanding. Mark, you wouldn't. I would do whatever it takes to protect our future, he said, just like I did with your father. Our future? I laughed, surprised by my own audacity. Rebecca, wake up. He's not protecting your future together. He's protecting his future, period. Mark swung the gun toward me. Swung the gun? I said shut up. He probably has another insurance policy, you know? Another plan for when you become inconvenient. That's enough. Mark's finger moved to the trigger. That's when Rebecca did something I never expected. She grabbed the heavy glass paperweight from the conference table and hit her husband in the head with it. Mark stumbled, the gun wavering in his grip. I dove across the table and grabbed his wrist, trying to control the weapon. Rebecca hit him again, this time hard enough to send him to the floor. The gun skittered across the carpet and I kicked it toward the door. Mark was groaning, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Rebecca stood over him, still holding the paperweight, her face a mask of rage and betrayal. You killed my father, she said. You killed him and you were going to kill my sister and then you were going to kill me. Rebecca. Mark tried to sit up. She hit him again. That's when the conference room door burst open and 3 Chicago police officers rushed in, followed by Malloy. Hands where we can see them, the lead officer shouted. I raised my hands immediately. Rebecca dropped the paperweight and did the same. Mark was barely conscious on the floor. Officer Johnson, I said to the lead cop. I'm Kimberly Walker. This man just threatened me with a gun. And both of these people are suspects in the murder of my father. The next few hours were a blur of statements and paperwork. Mark was arrested for assault with a deadly weapon and conspiracy to commit murder. Rebecca was arrested for her role in Dad's death. I learned later that she'd made a full confession within 2 hours, probably hoping for a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. The gun Mark had been carrying was registered to him, which suggested this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment decision. He'd been prepared to kill me from the beginning. What made Rebecca turn on him? I asked Malloy as we left the police station. Self-preservation. Once she realized he was planning to eliminate her too, the marriage stopped being more important than her life. Do you think she was telling the truth? About not knowing he planned to kill her? Malloy shrugged. Does it matter? She helped murder your father. Whether she knew about Mark's future plans doesn't change that. He was right. Of course. Rebecca's last-minute crisis of conscience didn't absolve her of Dad's death, but it had saved my life. 6 months later, I sat in a Chicago courtroom listening to a prosecutor explain to 12 jurors exactly how my sister and brother-in-law had committed murder. The trial had been delayed twice while both sides prepared their cases, giving me time to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I'd moved to a different apartment, started seeing a therapist, and tried to process the fact that my entire family structure had been built on lies. Rebecca had pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for testifying against Mark, who was facing charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Her lawyer had argued that she'd been manipulated by an abusive husband, but the financial evidence suggested she'd been a willing participant in the planning stages. Mark's defense strategy was to blame everything on Rebecca, claiming he'd been an innocent husband who'd discovered his wife's crimes too late to stop them. Neither story was entirely true, but that's what trials are for, sorting through competing narratives to find something resembling justice. I was the prosecution's key witness, the person who'd overheard the conversation that started the investigation. For 3 hours, I sat on the witness stand and recounted every detail of that horrible day at Dad's funeral. Ms. Walker, the prosecutor asked, when you heard the defendants discussing your father's death, what was your immediate reaction? I realized they had murdered him, I said, and I realized I was probably next. Mark's lawyer objected, claiming my testimony was speculation rather than fact. But the medical evidence backed up everything I'd overheard. Dr. Martinez's office manager testified about the falsified medical records and the payments Mark had made for insulin prescriptions. A forensic accountant explained how they'd been stealing from the business to finance their lifestyle upgrades. The coroner who'd performed Dad's autopsy testified about elevated insulin levels that were consistent with intentional overdose. Most damaging of all was the recording Malloy had made of our final confrontation. The jury heard Mark threaten me with a gun and essentially confessed to murdering Dad. Rebecca's testimony was devastating to her husband's defense. She explained how Mark had gradually convinced her that Dad was becoming incompetent and that they needed to take control of the business before he ruined everything. At first, we were just going to wait for him to retire, she said from the witness stand. But Mark said we couldn't afford to wait. He said Dad was making terrible business decisions that would bankrupt us all. When did the plan change from waiting to actively harming your father? The prosecutor asked. Mark started talking about how easy it would be to adjust Dad's medication. He said it would just speed up the natural progression of his diabetes, make him incompetent faster so we could take control legally. And you agreed to this? Rebecca's voice broke. I thought we were just going to make him confused enough that he'd agree to retire. I didn't know Mark was planning to kill him. That part was probably true. Rebecca was selfish and greedy, but I don't think she'd set out to become a murderer. Mark, on the other hand, had planned everything methodically. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with their verdict. Mark Thompson was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and financial fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Walker Thompson was sentenced to 15 years for voluntary manslaughter and conspiracy. As the judge read the sentences, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but sadness. These people had been my family, flawed and dysfunctional, but still family. Now they were criminals who would spend the best years of their lives in prison. But Dad was still dead, and nothing was going to change that. After the trial, I inherited Walker Real Estate completely. The business that had been slowly stolen from me was now entirely mine to do with as I pleased. I sold it within a month. The money from the sale, combined with Dad's life insurance and personal assets, left me financially secure for the first time in my adult life. I could have stayed in Illinois, started over with a new business, tried to rebuild some connection to the community where I'd grown up. Instead, I moved to Colorado. Denver seemed like the right choice, far enough from Illinois to escape the constant reminders of what had happened, but not so far that I felt completely disconnected from everything familiar. I used part of the money to start a small consulting business, helping family-owned companies navigate succession planning and conflict resolution. It was ironic, considering my own family's spectacular failure, but I'd learned a lot about what not to do. The therapy helped. Dr. Sandra Martinez, no relation to the murdered doctor, specialized in trauma and family betrayal. She helped me understand that grieving the loss of my family structure was just as legitimate as grieving Dad's death. You didn't just lose your father, she explained during one session. You lost your entire understanding of who these people were and what your relationships meant. That was exactly right. I hadn't just discovered that Rebecca and Mark were murderers. I discovered that every family interaction I'd had for months had been based on lies. Every conversation, every shared meal, every expression of concern had been part of an elaborate performance while they planned my death. Learning to trust my own judgment again took time. But slowly, carefully, I started building a new life that didn't revolve around family obligation or fear of betrayal. 5 years after the trial, I got a letter from Rebecca. She was serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center in Central Illinois, and apparently she'd been thinking about our relationship. The letter was 5 pages of handwritten apology, explanation, and requests for forgiveness. "I know you have no reason to believe me," she wrote, "but I never intended for things to go as far as they did. Mark convinced me that Dad was going to destroy everything our family had worked for, and I let my fear override my moral compass." She went on to explain that she'd been in therapy herself, working through issues of self-worth and control that had made her vulnerable to Mark's manipulation. She claimed to have found God in prison and to be genuinely remorseful for her actions. "I know I can never undo what I did to our father, or the pain I caused you," the letter continued, "but I hope that someday you might be able to forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours." I read the letter 3 times before deciding what to do with it. Then I threw it away. Not because I couldn't forgive Rebecca. That was a process I was still working through with Dr. Martinez's help. But because forgiveness didn't require maintaining a relationship with someone who'd proven herself capable of murder. Rebecca had made her choices. Dad was still dead because of those choices, and I'd spent 5 years learning to live with the consequences. Nothing in her letter changed those fundamental facts. Some relationships can't be repaired, no matter how much therapy and time are involved. Mark never wrote to me, which was probably wise. His appeals had been unsuccessful, and he was settling into a life sentence with the kind of resignation that suggested he finally understood the scope of his crimes. I kept in touch with Malloy, who'd become something like a friend through our shared experience of the investigation. He told me that Mark had been placed in protective custody after receiving threats from other inmates who didn't appreciate his crimes against family. "Prison justice," Malloy said with dark satisfaction. "Even criminals have standards about certain things." Dr. Martinez's family had filed a wrongful death lawsuit against both Rebecca and Mark, which they'd won by default, since both defendants were incarcerated and had no assets to pay damages. It was symbolic justice, but sometimes symbols matter. On the 5th anniversary of Dad's death, I drove back to Illinois to visit his grave. The headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and an inscription I'd chosen: "Beloved father and honest businessman." I brought yellow roses, since Rebecca had claimed they were his favorites. I still wasn't sure if that was true, but it seemed like an appropriate gesture anyway. "I hope you'd be proud of how this turned out," I said to the headstone. Justice took a while, but it came eventually. Standing in that cemetery, I realized something important had changed in the 5 years since Dad's funeral. I was no longer afraid. Not of being alone, not of making decisions without family approval, not of trusting my own judgment when something felt wrong. Rebecca and Mark had taken my father and my sense of safety, but they hadn't broken my spirit. If anything, they'd forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed. The consulting business was growing steadily, and I'd recently hired 2 employees to help with the increased workload. My specialty was family business mediation, helping resolve conflicts before they escalated to the level of violence or criminal behavior. I was also dating someone. David was a forensic accountant I'd met through work, someone who understood complicated family dynamics and the importance of clear documentation in business relationships. He knew about my history, and he admired how I'd handled an impossible situation. "You survived something that would have destroyed most people," he'd told me early in our relationship. "That's not just impressive, it's inspiring." 5 years ago, I'd been a struggling real estate agent overshadowed by her successful sister and overlooked by her family. Today, I was a business owner, a survivor, and a woman who'd learned to value her own judgment over others' approval. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. As I left the cemetery that day, I made myself a promise. I would never again ignore my instincts about people's behavior, never again sacrifice my safety for someone else's comfort, and never again accept being treated as less important than other family members. Rebecca and Mark had taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between family obligation and self-preservation. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones you most need protection from. But they'd also taught me something else, that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about building a life worth living after you've escaped the people trying to destroy you. Standing in the Colorado sunshine outside my new home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. Not the desperate hope for family approval I'd clung to for decades, but actual contentment with the life I'd built for myself. Dad would have been proud of that too. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding strength in impossible situations. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-preservation? Share your experience in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else who's facing a similar situation. Remember, you deserve better than people who see you as disposable, even if those people are family. Trust your instincts, protect yourself, and never apologize for choosing to survive.